Welcome to the Copeland Coaching Podcast, where it's all about turning your job search into a slam dunk. Your host is Angela Copeland.
Welcome to the Copeland Coaching Podcast. I'm your host, Angela Copeland. On the phone with me today, I have Andie Kramer in Chicago, Illinois. Andie is a partner in the international law firm of McDermott, Will, and Emery. She's also the co-author of the book, Breaking Through Bias, Communication Techniques for Women to Succeed at Work, along with her husband and practicing attorney, Al Harris. Andie, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much, Angela. I'm glad to be here.
Well, I'm glad to have you. And, a big topic that's really coming up a lot lately, I'm just hearing a lot of people talking about it, is unconscious bias and the way that it impacts our workplace. So before we kind of jump into too much detail in our conversation, I want to kind of start with the basics. Help us to understand what is unconscious bias, and maybe you could give us an example.
Sure. In today's world, people try very hard, most people, not everybody, but most people try very hard that if they have, negative views or predetermined views about particular people, they try to avoid reacting to them. And that would be conscious bias. But all of us, from the time we're 3 or 4 years old, we have developed stereotypes about women, men. You're old and I'm young. You're a boy and I'm a girl. Your skin is a different color from mine. And those sorts of stereotypes and the biases that flow from them, we carry around with us our whole lives. And we don't intentionally use our views to hold people back. But unconscious bias is very much like, you may have seen that optical illusion where it's got a line with arrows pointing out, and then a line where the arrows point in at the end of the line. And if you're asked for that optical illusion, which line is longer, you're going to see the line that has the arrows pointed out as being bigger than the one that has the arrows pointed in. And what's that about? That's about our minds thinking that the line's longer when in fact it's not. And so that's really what unconscious bias is because what happens is we have views about other people that we don't intend to impose those views on our reactions to other people, but we can't help ourselves. And so it's not intentional, and that's why it's called unconscious. And it's things that we can try to manage and control, but the reality is that when we have reactions to people who are different from us, then it's inevitable that there could be unconscious bias involved.
Absolutely. And I think, like you said, it seems like it's something that we may not even be aware of. Like we may be trying our best to be fair and equal, and yet we still kind of carry these biases around sort of without even knowing it.
Absolutely. And if you slapped a lie detector test on the most biased person that you know, and you asked them if they were biased, they would pass the lie detector test with flying colors that when they say, no, I'm not biased, because they believe it.
That's a good point. Well, so when it comes to, you mentioned unconscious bias as it relates to women, like that being kind of one of the topics. And I think sometimes when we have that conversation, we assume that it means that, men have a bias towards women. But I kind of get the impression that sometimes we as women also have a bias towards women. And I'm curious, what do you think about that? Is it a one-way street, or are we both kind of doing it?
Well, you've touched on a very important point, which is that we all, men and women, boys and girls, grow up where we're told basically society feeds us the same the same stereotypes. And so what happens is women have the same stereotypes about women and men that men have about women and men. And in fact, the first book that I did with my husband was about the bias in general, breaking through bias and the communication techniques for women to succeed. And what we found was we were asked all the time questions like from women, like things like, I'm fine working with the men. It's the women I hate working with. And so we actually started to do a lot of research on that. And a new book of ours that's coming out in August of this year is about women working with women. It's not you, it's the workplace, women's conflict at work, and the bias that built it. And women carry the same biases about women that men do. And so we do hold them. And it does affect our relationships with women as well as our relationships with men.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's kind of surprising, but I'll share with you, this is something I don't probably admit very freely. I went to college in upstate New York and I was coming fresh out of Oklahoma. And I actually went to college with almost all men. One of my roommates in college, who is a man, he grew up in Portland, Oregon. And I remember meeting him freshman year, and we were 18 and having conversations with him like you do in college. You talk about all sorts of topics. And my unconscious bias sort of indirectly came out. And he looked at me because he's coming straight from Portland where things were very different than Oklahoma. And he
Sure.
said, "Wow, you are the most sexist woman I've ever met."
Nothing to be proud of.
Right. Right. I mean, I've grown since then. I actually think he and I have probably both kind of met in the middle. We're probably more both sort of in the middle of the spectrum. We were probably at opposite ends, but it was interesting to sort of meet that issue head on and to think, wow, I didn't even know this about myself. And since then I've like I said, I've evolved, but that was quite an interesting discovery.
Absolutely. And it's a good thing that you figured it out at 18 instead of 48, 58, 68.
Right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, well, so a lot of times when I talk to folks, I hear this, assumption. There's an assumption that comes up that, women, part of the reason we don't achieve more senior levels at work, part of the reason that we aren't the C-level executives is because we're just not interested. And that, if we were interested, the jobs are there, it's available. And I will say, as an executive myself, as an executive woman, I can attest that this isn't true for all women. I know that there are women who want those senior level positions. And so I'm curious from your perspective, why do you think that there are less women who achieve this high level kind of position?
Well, I agree with you that there are women who want to succeed. Many, many women want to succeed in their careers. Um, and what happens is that because our workplaces are predominantly run by senior men, our workplaces have what Al and I refer to as gendered workplaces, where masculine norms and values are what runs the organization. And what happens is we've talked about gender bias. There's another bias called affinity bias, which is that people tend to relate better with, like to hang around with people who are like them. So when we have organizations that are run by senior men, they tend to favor other men. And most of the organizations in the United States, obviously not all of them, but most of them, those that are run by senior men, tend to build unintentional barriers against women's advancement. And so women, the studies show that women, when we get out of school, are as ambitious and in fact, women tend to do better in school than men do. So the women get out of school with having won all the awards, gotten all the fancy degrees, and then when they get to the workplace, it's not as if they've had a lobotomy, but they don't know the secret handshake.
Mhm.
And a lot of this is because of the bias that is baked into our workplaces in the United States.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
and so if you've got a choice, if you feel like you're hitting your head against the wall, at some point you may throw up your hands and say, enough of this. I'm going to go do something else.
Mhm. I think it's tough, and you mentioned, like, the secret handshake. I've seen it, whether it's all the guys at work go golfing or, there's beers after work that all the guys go to, and it helps to build those relationships, which really help to ensure that someone can kinda move to the next level, and if you're not part of that club, sometimes you sorta get left out.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's
Well.
harder for the women because sometimes they're really not welcome.
Mhm.
But one of the tricks that we tell women is that very often, excuse me, if the men are going out to lunch, there's nothing wrong with saying, "Can I join you?" It's very hard for them to say no to you if you're standing there when they're getting ready to go to lunch.
That's
Um,
true.
and so you can find that over time, you get an opportunity to um, be seen in the informal social settings that are so important for career advancement.
Mhm. Yeah, those social settings are very important. Well, you mentioned, there are I mean, I talk to men every day who really believe that things should be equal, and I know that our listeners feel that way too. But I think sometimes the men that I talk to, at least, they want things to be equal, but they don't really know, like, how can they help? Like, what's their part in all of that? And I'm curious, like, if we're listening today and we happen to be a man who believes in this issue of equality, like, what can we do to help our female peers at work?
Well, one of the first things is to get information about the issues that their female peers experience, because information is power. And with information, men can become fabulous allies to support and help the advancement of their female colleagues. But a couple of real easy things that they can do, instead of always thinking about the young man to give him the plum assignment, think about who else is there who could do this work, and choose a woman or a person of color. Step out of the box a little bit. Give them a chance, because very often women and people of color don't get the same opportunities as the men that look like the senior men get. And so it's very important that they do get opportunities, because the way you're going to advance in your career, we all have to have a baseline of competent expertise. But at some point, um, you also need to have demonstrated that you've got what it takes to go to the next level, that you've got what it takes to be able to take on a complicated project or deal with a difficult customer or whatever.
Mhm.
And so think about adding women to your team. Think about adding them and inviting them to lunch and to informal get-togethers.
Mhm.
Those are two very simple things that could go a very long way.
I totally agree. The thing that I sometimes hear when I have this conversation or when I overhear a conversation on this topic, sometimes is the person will say, "Well, I don't want to, give the woman the plum assignment just because she's a woman." But I don't hear that. I don't think that's what you're saying. I think you're
No,
saying
not at all.
you often have two people who have equal potential and equal qualifications. And if someone's picking, they typically default to the person that's the most similar to them, which is often the man.
Exactly.
And what I hear you saying is you have these two people who are equally qualified. Consider giving the one who's a little different than you personally a chance.
Exactly. And it's sometimes harder because with affinity bias, the other person can complete your sentence for you. And when you're working with somebody who's different from you, then what happens is it may be a little harder. But the reality is that the fact that it is harder actually can give you a better end product. That the ability to think and have people thinking in different ways. I'll give you an example. There's a study of mock juries which had six white men, and some had six white men, and some had three white men and three black men. And the juries that were comprised, and they all saw the same, stage theatrical trial. And so then they were in deliberation as to what they were going to do with, what decision they were going to make. And the juries that were consisted of just white men turned out that they didn't ask as many questions. They did not deliberate as long. They didn't have as good a grasp of the facts, and they thought that it was easy and they had it all figured out. When it was three white men and three black men, what happened was the deliberation took longer. They were more careful and thoughtful about the facts and what they were learning. They had a better grasp of it, and their decisions were more appropriate given the trial that had been presented to them. And so when you're with people who are not exactly like you, what happens is you slow down, you think a little bit slower, you try to accommodate and understand the other person's position. And that's really what it's all about. That's why diversity is not just the right thing to do, but it turns out that it makes organizations more profitable.
Mm-hmm.
And they're more
Absolutely.
profitable because they're thinking outside the standard box of, we all think the same, and, let's just get the job done as fast as we can.
Right. Right. And I hear like almost like an opportunity for creativity and problem solving. Like when you have those different sort of voices at the table, like you said, not everybody's going to come up with the exact same solution. So it gives you a lot more options.
Right. And another thing that men can do, because the only way that we're going to solve the problems of gender bias and affinity bias is if men step up, because since they're the ones that tend to run the organizations, it's not going to change if with just women talking to ourselves.
Hmm.
And so another thing that men can do is, because of the stereotypes that men are expected to be, assumed to be, and punished if they're not strong and independent and willing to take a stand, and women are expected to be, assumed to be, and punished if we're not nice and kind and sweet, then what happens is women who act outside of the stereotype of nice and kind and sweet, who are sort of, you do this and you do that, and we're going to meet at 5:00 and we're going to see where we're at. Not just the men's hair catch fire, but the women's hair catch fire. Who does she think she is?
Hmm.
But a man who asks, who does the exact same thing, nobody questions who does he think he is. They just get on it, so they're ready at 5:00.
Hmm. Yeah, I think it really comes down to two, like getting everybody to believe that it's a real issue. Because, like you said, when the men typically are the ones in power, if this is sort of like not their problem, not their issue, it doesn't get solved. Like
That's correct.
both sides have to work together, to really make a difference on this issue.
Absolutely.
Well, recently the Me Too movement has been all over the place for a while now. And when it first came about, I remember being so excited and so relieved that we were finally having this conversation. Because I know for me, I mean, I've had situations at work that I could identify with this movement a lot, whether it was someone, putting their hand on my knee or just any kind of like thing that has happened. And I
Yes.
remember thinking like, oh, we're finally going to talk about it. It's finally going to be real. And I have been in situations recently, like within the past, I'll say month, I was at a party and a man at the party, another man came up to me and he super nice, friendly, like forward thinking kind of guy. And he said, "Man, Angela, this Me Too movement, I'm really glad it's happening. It's really important. But I got to tell you, I'm not going to be in my office alone with a woman ever again in a business meeting because, I mean, the risk is just too high that I might get accused of something. And I've got too much to lose. I can't go down that route." And that really shocked me. I mean, I've heard it a few times, but it just hit me in the face because I thought, are we I don't know, I feel like maybe it's backfiring on us in a way and, like, hurting us in a way because we're being excluded, and I don't know, I kinda wanted to get your perspective on this particular issue.
Well, you've really touched on the raw chord here that it's really the raw, it's a raw nerve, I guess is the right way to describe that. But here's the problem. The problem is that if the only way women can advance is if they're given the same opportunities as men. And there was a Harvard Business Review uh, article in 2010 about how women need to get the same opportunities to have the appropriate male advocacy, and that if they don't get male sponsorship, they're not going to reach the top, and that they need to be interacting in businesses one-on-one with senior male leaders. So if the men are saying, there's no way I'm going to meet with a woman by myself because I don't want to get accused of something, we really need to stop there and peel it back for a minute. Because, first of all, there's no indication that women make this stuff up. Men who are, I'm sure though that just like there are men and women who make things up. So I'm sure that there's something there, but there's no indication that the allegations really are coming from false, false accusations. And so what we need to do is we need to make it clear to men that it's an important part of their job to promote and advance women. And one of the things is that organizations, instead of just hoping that the men are going to support and mentor women, need to have formal mentorship programs where they require men to mentor women, because there aren't enough senior women to mentor all the women, and men have a lot to offer as well. And so one of the things is that if it's part of your job, then it's not going to be perceived as something as being inappropriate. If you know that John was asked to mentor Sarah, and he's meeting with her, well, that's part of his job. And so one of the things is organizations need to make it clear that they expect men to mentor women. But the other thing is that being in your office one-on-one with a woman is not scary. You don't have to invite her out to a candlelit dinner to talk about your work projects. And that's really where the issues come up, where the social and the professional can get blurred, or the expectations can be different. And one of the problems with the Me Too movement is important, and hopefully it is going to do and has already done some important things. But we can't allow men to use it as a shield. Men of good intentions should not be using it as a shield to avoid working with women.
I agree. I actually have a male friend that shared with me, he's very progressive, also feels, that women should be treated equally. And one thing he shared with me was he said, I would never imagine doing the things that men have been accused of through this Me Too movement. And he said, so part of the reason I have felt scared, he was kind of telling me, this is a different man actually.
Sure.
Part of the reason I feel scared about being accused is that I have a really hard time imagining that anyone would do these things because I would never do those things. And they're just so far out of my reality that I can't picture that this stuff is really happening because I've never seen it. And he actually said, no man has ever treated a woman this way in front of me. So he said, I've never even observed this one time in my entire 20-year career at work. I've never, ever seen this happen. So I think that's maybe another part of this is,
right.
that if you're one of the good guys who really is out there doing a fair job,
Mhm.
that you can't even picture that this could happen.
Well, there's a couple of interesting, if we peel that back a little bit, a couple of interesting points. One of them is he may not see it because he's blind to it. And very often men don't see these sorts of things because they're not sensitive to how they play out, or how a woman would react to it. So
Mhm.
that's sort of part of it, because of their affinity bias. And very often men who are in the same room don't experience things the same way that women do, because they don't get it. That's sort of part of the problem.
Mhm.
The other thing is that, um, all he has to do is read some of the allegations against, the Harvey Weinsteins of the world, and he'll understand pretty quickly that it's happening. And even if somebody's not done that in front of him, that doesn't mean that he hasn't gone to another guy. He hasn't gone to a woman's desk and put his hand on her thigh, or
Mhm.
said inappropriate things when it's the two of them. And for men who would never imagine doing those sorts of things, then they ought to continue to be mentoring and sponsoring and supporting women, because it's critical that, um, the only way women are going to advance is if we have those opportunities.
Mhm. Absolutely right. Yeah, I totally agree. Well, I know, one of the things I believe that you talk about sometimes is bias in the hiring process. And, when we think about a job interview, I mean, job interviews are really, really quick. And it's very, very hard for a hiring manager to know who's going to do the best job. Like, it's they're looking at your resume, you answer a couple of questions. A lot of times it really comes down to sort of like a gut reaction in that moment.
Mhm.
But the
Right.
thing I have seen that for me has been, I'll be honest, kind of disturbing is especially with technology companies. I've seen this a lot in the past couple of years. There's technology companies that actually do this process when the candidate leaves after the day of interviews, they take a vote. And I don't mean like, oh, they have a conversation about did the candidate seem like they're able to do the job, but they literally take a vote. Did you like this person or not? Yes or no? And unless the candidate gets a unanimous yes across the board, they can be eliminated for one no on the basis of culture fit.
Yes. Mhm.
I'm curious, what do you think about this idea of culture fit and having it being used in this way?
Well, a couple of problems with that, but the most obvious one is that, um, culture fit is, is a way of allowing affinity bias to rule your company. So that culture fit is, she's not like me, or he's not like me. And that's why, did you like this person or not? Maybe she was, too she didn't play the passive female role, the way that they wanted her to. There's all sorts of issues that come up with, um, the relying on culture, or because that ends up being the way that, uh, you're going to stay the same, you're going to look the same in 10 years that you look today,
Mm,
which very often is just a lot of white men.
mhm.
And it excludes women, and it excludes people of color. The problem with that, and one of the techniques that we talk about, in our both of our books about hiring, is that you ought to be removing a lot excuse me, of the discretion, from the hiring process. Not so that you have to take people that you don't want. We're not suggesting that at all. But the reality is that if you know what the job description is, what you should do is you should be identifying people who are qualified to do that job without looking at their name.
Yes.
And the studies show that the exact same resume, I'll give you a couple of examples. The exact same resume was sent around to some huge number of professors of science and around the United States, and they were told that they were being asked to identify the best candidates for managing a lab manager. And the exact same resume. The only thing was different was that some of them were Sam, and 50% were Sam, and 50% of them were Sally. And the lab managers consistently said that they would hire Sam over Sally, that Sam's resume was better. He was better for the job. They would give him a higher starting salary if they were going to even consider giving Sally a job. And they would give him more time mentoring. And the resumes were identical. And the same studies have been done where you use ethnic names or names that appear to be something other than, John Smithish type names. And the same thing happens where the people whose names appear to be ethnic don't even get past the computer screening.
Yeah, I think it's so disturbing. I mean, as you've thought through that issue, just the names in particular, um, do you have any thoughts on how, if we're a job candidate and we have a woman's name or an ethnic name, I mean, is there just no way around it? Or, I mean, it's
Well, the organizations can do a lot. They can
sure.
identify, they can screen resumes by removing the name and removing information that is clearly going to trigger what the gender or what the racial or ethnic background is of the candidates.
Right.
They can clearly do things like that. And when they do, the studies show that people of color and women get more opportunities. I'll give you an example. In the United States, in the 1970s, symphony orchestras were almost completely white men. And they started in the 1970s to do what was called blind auditions, where they would put up a screen and the judges would be listening to the performers without seeing who they were.
Mhm.
And the women who would walk across the stage to get to their instrument would even take off their shoes if they were wearing high heels so they couldn't
Oh,
hear the clip clop.
right.
And symphony orchestras now are almost 50-50 women and men. And
Wow,
you'll
that's
see people of
incredible.
color now. And so blind auditioning, you can apply that concept to the recruiting process.
Mhm. Absolutely. Well, it kind of leads me into sort of another question, and I feel like this almost goes without saying, but
Go for it.
yeah, I need to ask you. So, as I mentioned, I live in the middle of the country. I live in Memphis, and you know, as I talk about these issues a lot with friends, and I've had friends say to me, Angela, you know, the idea that there is a gender bias in hiring is just not true. Like I had a good friend who's a recruiter tell me this. He said, companies, they're looking for the best person. Like they don't care what that person looks like. And his feedback to me was, this is a myth. This is some propaganda made up by liberal people, and it's just not true. And you shouldn't be talking about this because it's not true. And like from your perspective, I mean, you've mentioned a couple of studies already, but I mean, what do you say or what do you think when you hear this kind of feedback that this is a myth?
Well, the problem is that because of affinity bias and gender bias, what happens is the people who are reviewing these resumes actually believe that they are picking the best people for the organization. So, what you need to do is you need to take discretion out of the selection process so that other people get a chance. For example, in the NFL, the all of the coaches and managers were white, and a lot of the football players were black. And Rooney, one of the owners of one of the NFL teams, started what's referred to as the Rooney Rule, where he says that every job for I think they call them the front office. Every front office job, you have to have at least X% of people of color. And that doesn't mean that they get the job, but it means that they get the interview. And what's happened is the racial makeup of the front office has changed in the NFL, where there are African American men and Hispanic men who would never have been considered before. And so there's your friend who says this is a liberal myth. There's a lot of literature out there that would show that this is not the case, that it is a true serious problem.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, so as we're talking sort of about hiring and the challenges in hiring, I will be honest, like in my own experience, and I'm talking from personal experience, when I have been on job interviews, I have been asked tons and tons of times questions that are illegal. And I can think of one interview in particular for a big company that I won't mention.
Sure.
Where the C-level executive who interviewed me said, "Are you married? Do you have children? And do you plan to have any children soon?" And lately, like when I've seen this question, it comes wrapped up in the question about relocation. It'll be, I see that you're going to be relocating across the country. I'm curious, like, what exactly is it we're going to be relocating? Are we going to be relocating children? What's going to be happening?
Right.
And I'll be honest, like, as I have talked over this issue with friends, the feedback, especially from my male friends, has been, "Oh, Angela, they're just trying to get to know you. Why do you have to be so sensitive about this issue?" And I have a really hard time thinking, first of all, that men are being asked if they're planning to have children soon in an interview just as a question because you're trying to get to know them. But
Right.
this is a question I will say when I've interviewed, I've seen this about 30% of the time I'm asked these questions,
Right.
which is a
Mhm.
really high
Yeah.
probability. I'm curious from your perspective, how should we react? I mean, there's times where we really want this job, and I feel like if we react badly, we're going to get eliminated. So I don't have a good answer for how to answer these questions.
Well, you're right. You got to be very careful. You can't look at the guy and say to him, "Oh, that was illegal," because obviously they're going to find some other reason not to hire you. But one of the ways that you might want to think about responding in that situation is, well, I'm ready to I'm ready to relocate, and that's why I'm interested in this job. And um, my personal situation has nothing to do with my career aspirations. I have a friend who was asked the very same questions, and the response, the question she got was, "Well, your husband is the CEO of his own company in this town. Why would he, why would you think that you would be suitable for a job 2,000 miles away, at this other company?" And she looked at him and she said, "Well, my husband is plans to relocate wherever I go."
Mm-hmm.
And, the people didn't believe her. Well, her husband relocated where he's relocated 3 times where she's moved to, for career moves over her career, because he is supportive. Not all men can imagine that, though. They really don't get it.
Right.
But it's not a question that is appropriate. And as you said, it is illegal. But to start wagging your finger is as good as not getting the job. So you need to very often think about other ways of responding,
Mm-hmm.
knowing that there will be some people who deserve and should be, called on the carpet or sanctioned for those sorts of questions.
hmm I had an experience once where I was asked what like if I was in a relationship or if I was married, and everyone in the interviews asked me or shared with me their personal, like whether they were married or had children. And I was kind of I was directly asked those questions myself. And I sort of sidestepped them, like you said, in a really sort of try to be graceful about it, try
Right.
to address what's really at the heart of the fact that you can do the work. And in the end, that company's HR person called me and said, we just felt like you were a little bit evasive when we tried to get to know you. And so we've eliminated you because you were evasive with some of our questions, because I didn't answer those questions head on. So I like the idea of giving kind of sidestepping the questions a little bit, but I found that it doesn't always work,
Oh, absolutely. That was my point about my friend actually
Yeah.
saying, my husband will go wherever I go.
Right. It's tough.
It is. And the fact that these questions are illegal doesn't help you when you're trying to get a job, because
Right.
unless you choose to, go after them later with good luck, because when you're there's all sorts of reasons that they can come up with as to why they chose not to give you the offer.
Right. I think when we're looking at it from a distance, we don't realize just how hard it is to actually go after a company for asking illegal question. I mean, I'm sure there's just the fact that they asked it, even as a job seeker, you probably don't have any documentation of what was actually said. And just like you said, they can come up with other reasons. So it's a
Sure.
hard thing to,
Well, it is an issue,
right.
and it is the way that many of the discrimination laws work, um, are that it if you have the job, it's and you lose it, it's a lot easier to bring an action because you were discriminated against after you've gotten a job. But getting the job is where
Mhm.
it becomes very difficult, and much harder for women.
Right, right, right. Well, I've learned, I mean, we're talking about all these biases, right? Like oftentimes, especially as a female executive, when you go in and you interview, sometimes you're the only woman that's interviewing and everyone
Right.
else is a man and on your competition. And I know one of the issues that you talk about is actually how to overcome the bias, like how to get past it. What tips do you have for us if we are a woman in this situation?
Well, one of the things is that, because of the stereotypes that women are supposed to be nice and kind and sweet, if we're too nice and kind and sweet, what we're perceived as great to have around, but maybe we'll put you on the library committee.
Mhm.
But if we're too hard and confident and competent, then people don't like us because they think that we make them uncomfortable because we're outside of the stereotype. And my husband and I call that the Goldilocks dilemma, where women are treated as too hard or too soft, but rarely just right. So
Mhm.
when women are confronted with these sorts of situations, what we need to do is we need to balance some of the communal, kind, nice characteristics with the tough stuff. And so, one way of overcoming gender bias when we are confronted with it is to keep in mind: do we need to dial up our more our tougher sides, or do we need to dial it down? Do we need to dial up our kindness, sweet little whatever side, or dial it down? And women who are listening to this might be thinking, why do I have to do this? Men don't have to. And the reality is, yeah, that's correct. Men don't. But in a gender biased workplace, if you want to succeed, there are things that women need to do today to succeed. And at the same time, we can try to have the men in the organizations change the way that they that the way that they are to eliminate bias at the highest levels. But we can't wait in our career today. We can't wait for that to happen. So there are things that we can do to try to avoid, overcome, or confront head on the biases that women experience that men don't in their search for, the career of their dreams, frankly.
Mhm. Absolutely. I mean, I think that's really helpful. And once we do get the job and we're at work, I mean, one thing I've noticed, especially at the executive level, is sort of different styles between men and women. And I've seen companies where, the male executives are considered like very respected if they're sort of
Mhm.
like yelling or
Right.
shouting, and having arguments in meetings, like they're showing how important they are. And I feel like as a woman, I know at least for myself, when I've been in that situation, I find it really hard to figure out what my role is because I'm not going to start yelling. I mean, that's not
Right.
really acceptable. And so it's sort of, I think it presents like a challenging situation when the male executives are yelling. Well, it's kind of like, what is the female executive supposed to do to bring her power to the table in that setting?
Well, one of the things in our book Breaking Through Bias, we have all sorts of tips about what women can do. One of the things is that having a sense of humor and acting as if, not getting baited, it can become very valuable. And so one of the things to keep in mind is that if a woman doesn't take the bait and she's able to um, shift the focus, that can go a long way. Sometimes women are ignored at the table in a meeting, and one of the tips that we suggest is that she get up as if she was going to go get a glass of water, a cup of coffee or something. And then when she walks back to her seat, she doesn't sit down, but she stands at her chair and starts talking. It's much harder for people to ignore you when you're standing than they can when you're sitting, and their eyes are above the top of your head.
That's a really interesting tip. I've often made a point to kinda, like, sit in the middle of the table,
Right.
to be more prominent in the meeting, but I that's a really, really good idea. I've never thought of that.
Yep. There's power seats, there's power. Taking up space becomes very important. There's all sorts of tips, because the way we all communicate is we communicate with nonverbal body language, and we communicate with words and phrases, and then we also communicate digitally and in writing.
Mhm.
And we need to be certain that we're projecting a confident, competent image, even if we have to dial down our language sometimes so that we can get our points heard.
Well, this is excellent. Andy, you've given us so many good points to think about. If we wanna go and learn more about you and your work, and we wanna find your existing book and your new book about women working with women, where should we go?
Well, Al and I have a website, which is andieandal.com. And I spell Andie, Andie, which confuses people. So ANDIEANDAL.com. And we have blogs and an assessment, see how you would navigate gender biased or potentially gender biased workplaces. Our books are available on Amazon or Barnes and Noble or from your favorite bookseller. And we're right now in the pre-order stage for our second book. And so they're both available on Amazon, for example.
Excellent. Well, Andy, thank you so much for joining me today. This has been great.
Well, thank you. I've enjoyed talking with you, Angela.
And thank you for listening. If you've enjoyed the episode today, please don't forget to help me out. Go to Apple Podcasts and subscribe to the show. The more listeners we have, the easier it is for other people to find the show.
Thank you for listening to the Copeland Coaching Podcast today with your host, Angela Copeland. Tune in next time to get more great tips on turning your job search into a slam dunk.